guys, so today I'm going to start a new set of lectures. These are going to be geared towards general biology students that are just starting out college and maybe they're taking an introductory biology class. And so we'll just kind of have a lecture that is posted each week on one of the topics associated with a general biology curriculum, similar to the one that I'm going to be using, which is the Neil Campbell and Reese's biology book. So let's get started. So our objective of this course is going to be basically to give you an introduction to kind of the theoretical and practical principles of modern biology. Just kind of give you a background information, introductory information on basic concepts that are in your typical biology curriculum, introductory biology curriculum. Much of the stuff that you will learn in here will also be applicable to an AP biology course or a high school biology course as well. So to start off with, we are going to talk about what is biology itself. What is the field of biology? So the field of biology is all about exploring life and understanding its the way it happens, the way it keeps moving, and the way you can change it and alter it in some cases. So we will talk about the basic units that can be considered living in life. We will talk about characteristics of living things. How do we categorize something as living versus non-living? We will talk about how living things are organized in the world around us. And then we will talk about how the living creatures and the living things in our world evolve and change over time in order to survive in a particular setting. And how they diversify to change and adapt with the changing environment of their, basic living place. And then finally, we will also explore a little bit about the scientific method that is used to study life and experimental protocols in general. So before we can talk about biology, we're going to take a little bit of a step back. And we will talk about, a little bit broader topic, which is the field of science. Now, biology is just a small portion in that much larger field. But science is basically how we collect knowledge and how we catalog it about our natural world, whether it be pertaining to living things or non-living things, but things that are in our natural environment on this earth as well as beyond in outer space. So it will encompass the field of astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology. Those are four major sciences that are part of the natural world, and then subsets associated with that. Most scientific knowledge at the end of the day, as it becomes apparent that is the way things are moving along, are passed on in the form of theories, but they are also sometimes given as predictions and hypotheses that are getting tested at the time that we are exploring them. Now, going back to biology, biology specifically is study of living things or study of life. And so while, chemistry and geology and astronomy are still looking at natural world, they are not necessarily looking at things that are living. Biology is specifically looking at things that are living or life. And life, if you were to define that, is essentially, if you think about it, it is at the end of the day a lot of chemistry, right? It is a complex series of chemical reactions that come together to create a unit that can survive, that can perform work, that can adapt, and that can change in a given environment. So those complex series of chemical reactions that are in a structure in a particular place and are able to replicate themselves and survive is what would be the basics of life. So now let's talk about what is the scope of biology. What is it that it encompasses? So in biology, the usual things that we study and that we will be focusing on would be how living organisms exist, how they are created, and then how they are interacting with each other and with the environment that they are living in. And when you combine that information together, what you get are ecosystems that are essentially a series of living and non-living things that are linked to each other in some way so that they can work together in that environment to keep each other alive and also to maintain that environment that they are living in. So ecosystems generally are characterized by the cycling of these chemical nutrients from starting from the earth and then atmosphere and the soil, going into the plant, going into a small living thing that's consuming that, and to a larger one, and continuing this process until you get through all the organisms, all the living things that are present in that environment. Looking at that in and breaking those different categories down, you will see that living things can be in an ecosystem can be divided into three major categories. And those three major categories are going to be your producers, your consumers, and your decomposers. Producers are basically living things and living organisms that are producing nutrients and chemical nutrients that are needed for other living things in that ecosystem in order to survive. Consume or eat those producers in order to get their energy need met, in order to get those chemical nutrients that they need to survive. And then decomposers are living things that are going to then be breaking down these consumers and producers in order to break them down back into the basic nutrients that can go back into the environment, to the soil or to the atmosphere, so that they can continue to cycle back through the producers and consumers again. So here is an example of how this energy flow happens in an ecosystem, where sun, as our major flow of light energy, provides us this constant energy in the form of this light that is taken by producers in the form of plants, along with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the soil, to produce chemical nutrients in the form of glucose, in the form of starch, in the form of different parts. These plants are then consumed by insects and small consumers like your rabbits or other organisms, and those consumers, usually it could be that it is getting eaten by an animal like a bunny, or it could be eaten by something small like a mole or whatever. Small consumers that are herbivores and that are eating these plants. And then those consumers may be in a chain as well, where a small consumer is eaten by a larger consumer, which is eaten by an even larger, more stronger consumer. And these consumers, as they consume this product, are going to be, again, taking in oxygen, in this case from the atmosphere, in order to break those plants down, in order to break this food down, to get their energy need. And at the same time, they're going to be releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that can then be used by the producers again in their next cycle. The consumers also, as they break down this food, are going to be releasing some of that energy in the form of heat energy back into the atmosphere as well. Finally, you have decomposers like these worms that are breaking down the soil and the nutrients in that soil and breaking them down into a form that can then be consumed by the producers in order to make their food. So in this case, in this way, you essentially have within the ecosystem a cycling of energy from one place to the other, from one organism to the next, from one living form to the next, so that it maintains its environment in a particular way. So energy flows a single way into in an ecosystem, coming in from the sun to the producers, going to the consumers, and then back out in the form of heat energy, and then cycling back through that. The nutrients themselves cycle by taking, the producers are taking in a lot of these nutrients from the atmosphere, from the sunlight, from the soil. They're using them to make food in the form of glucose to make themselves. And then they are providing that to the consumers that are then again breaking them down to the components to utilize it for their own energy needs. So why study biology? Why should we care about that? Well, there are many reasons why a person may want to study the field of biology. One of them would obviously be to just understand and appreciate the world that you are living in, to appreciate the different organisms and the different living things that are present within this world and how they function. If we were to go into a university or a new job, when we start a new position, we want to know about our environment. We want to know about our peers. We want to know about our, the teachers, our students that we are going to be working with if you're in a school, or our co-workers and our boss, and the different rooms in the building if you're starting a new job. Because that will help us find our place in that environment, and it will help us know what our job is and what the other person's job is, so we know where to go for help and where to provide help, for example, or how to survive in that environment. Similarly, as human beings in an ecosystem within this world, it is our job to know about our environment and to know about all the players in this environment. So the field of biology helps us understand and appreciate all those parts that we are a part of, right? All the different components in this living world that we are a part of, that we should know about, that we should care about. It also helps us understand and develop medicine, nutrition, and science in general. So especially for people that are interested in going into medicine, understanding the field of biology is going to help us understand and then in the future develop our own theories and our own hypotheses about different fields in medicine and nutrition and in biological fields. It will help us again understand about our environment and understand environmental issues in a different way, not just as a political issue, not just as a issue that we hear about on the news all the time, but rather actually understand what the implications of those are. What is the implication of dirty water or inavailability of the fresh water source, or dirty air quality, or soil that is deprived of nutrients? How is that going to affect not only us, but also other living things around us? And knowing that we are all interconnected through this ecosystem helps us understand that environmental issue better and care about it better. It also helps us understand ethical issues in the case of human genome or stem cell research and gene therapy. Knowing how we are altering the genome and to what degree we can make these changes may help us understand why it is okay to perform certain types of stem cell research or gene therapy, and why it is considered, why it would be ethical versus unethical, instead of just going by what you hear on the news or in the media about these issues. And then finally, knowing our environment, knowing our place in the ecosystem, knowing the role of each one of these different units within that ecosystem will help us make an informed decision as a, as an actual working member of the society. When it comes to voting on issues related to science, medicine, environment, global warming, gene therapy in the future. So we will be able to make informed decision and not just a decision based on what our parents are making or what our peers are making without knowing about how it actually affects us. So let's go ahead and start with understanding when is something living versus when is something a non-living thing. So we will start off by looking at an image which is full of living as well as non-living things. So this canyon is majority of the things that you're seeing in here would be considered living things. It's full of life because starting from what's in the water with the small microbes to diatoms, maybe to anything that you can see moving in there. A lot of those, if there's any fish in there or tadpoles in there or frogs in there, those are all living things. Then you have your ferns and plants and animals that are living among these plants that are also going to be living in that state. Obviously the water itself, the rocks, the soil is not living, but a lot of the things that you're observing in that image are living things. Again, another example of living things would be this pack of wolves that are consumers in an ecosystem. Again, animals that are part of living things. So let's see what it is that makes these things living versus what it is that would be considered non-living. So here in this image, you are looking at a human being, but which is, we all know, is a living thing. But what we may not think about quite as easily as living is the circulatory system. Now, while the circulatory system of a human being or an animal, which is composed of, all the blood vessels, the heart, and everything, are not able to completely replicate and divide on their own, they still do represent life because it is composed of individual living cells that can have all the properties associated with life. So looking back at this here again, whether you're looking at a heart, a whole organ, a particular, small piece of tissue within that organ, or individual cells within that tissue, all of those represent life or living thing in some way, shape, or form. On the other end, when we go even more molecular in nature and go down to a single molecule, for example, a protein molecule like a hemoglobin, that now is no longer a living thing. That now is a non-living entity within the living system, which was our, the blood vessels that contain our red blood cells that contain hemoglobin to transport oxygen. So life on Earth is divided into different categories, and we can categorize the life on Earth into these individual settings. These are called kingdoms. And if we were to look at all the kingdoms that are present within life or living systems, there are six kingdoms of life. They start off with small single-celled organisms that are your archaeobacteria and the eubacteria. These contain, mostly unicellular, single-cell living things, small individual cells that are living and are able to do all the properties associated with life. And then you have your third big kingdom, which is your protista, which contains eukaryotic organisms that are both unicellular as well as multicellular. So Unicellular being, again, single-celled living cells, versus multicellular, where many, many different types of cells come together to create a more complex organism, able to do a lot more interesting functions. Now, eukaryotes can be divided into 3 more kingdoms, which are your plantae, animalia, and fungi. All these are eukaryotic cells, cellular systems that are living things. So here you have example of fungi, animals, and plants in the various pictures that are shown along with this. So the main diversity of life is arranged into 3 main domains, which were your eubacteria, archaeobacteria, and the protista. And then, so the first one is your eubacteria, which are most of the bacteria that you see in our living in our environment, and these are going to be single-celled organisms. Then you have your archaeobacteria, which are again single-celled prokaryotes, simpler cells. However, these usually are ones that can survive in very harsh circumstances, so they are unique in their own environment. And then you have your protista that encompass your plant, animal, and fungi, both unicellular and multicellular organisms. So these are your big 3. The third is one of your big domains associated with eukaryotes. The protozoa and algae fall into multiple kingdoms within this setting, just because there is a lot of diversity within them, and they can be found in different ways. So we're going to look at the basic difference between eukaryote and a prokaryote. So prokaryotes are very simple cellular structures where there is a cell that contains some type of a command center in the form of DNA inside it, and that's it. And then all the things that are needed for that cell to survive, all the functions that are needed are within that internal environment in a single setting. There are no compartments, there are no separations for different functions. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, contain the DNA in a actual category, in an actual room, so to speak. It has its own membrane, it has its own walls, and that's where DNA is in. That's your central command center. And then it has several other membrane enclosed organelles that can maintain that cell's function. Each organelle is specialized to do a particular function, whether it be in mitochondria to provide energy, or vacuoles to maintain the osmotic pressure, or the ER for transport and for production of proteins. Whatever it is, it has compartments that do specific works in each environment. Within the domain of eukarya, you have 4 different kingdoms. You have your protist, where you have protozoans and algae, which are your single kind of celled eukaryotes. And then you have your fungi, plant, and animals. In the other 3 kingdoms, those are all mostly multicellular organisms. Here are some examples of different types of eukaryotes that you can see in our environment. And just by looking at this little tiny snapshot, you can see how diverse these organisms are. So looking at this, you can wonder, how is it that this cell right here is a living thing, and this complex in the same kind of categorization as these complex structures in the plants and animals that are also living things. So what is it exactly that makes them living? So we've talked about life being defined as basically a complex physical structure that contains complex series of chemical reactions working together to maintain that physical state. Now, if we were to break that down further to look at specific characteristics of a living thing, what it boils down to are these few 6 or 7 properties that an organism must have, or that a living thing must have in order to be considered living. The first one is that it has to be able to acquire and use energy from either organic sources around it or from a producer, whatever it may be. The second property that it must have is that it must be able to reproduce itself and get more of itself going in an environment so that it maintains, their number and they don't go extinct. The third one is that they need to be able to grow and develop over time to make their final form and to change if needed. They also must be able to respond to environmental stimuli in order to survive, in order to respond to light or get away from harm, whatever the case may be. Then they must be able to adapt to a changing environment. A living thing that is unable to adapt to changing environment will eventually go extinct and would not be able to survive for a very long time. Many of your organisms, whether they are single-celled or multicellular organism, you will see that they have a high degree of organization. So there is a design to the madness. It's not just a balloon filled up with all the stuff that is needed. There is a design to where things are found and what function is performed by each thing within that environment. And finally, a living thing must be able to maintain homeostasis, which essentially means that they must be able to maintain their environment over time, over their life cycle, and in order to survive in that space. So that would be the main properties that you should know for a living thing to be considered living. So when we look at all the living things that are present in our environment, we see that these basic similarities remain in all of these organisms. So all living things will show some overlap in the chemical makeup and the chemical activities that are happening within their cells. So for all living things, they are made up of either a single or many cells coming together. The cells contain DNA that provide the blueprint for that particular organism. These cells also have building blocks in the form of nutrients that are then broken down to create building blocks of the cell. And these building blocks are the same regardless of what living thing you're looking at. The same components are needed for a DNA, for a protein, for different parts of the cell, for energy consumption. Using those basic building blocks, you can create millions of products, as you can see from the diversity in the life forms that you can see around you, just by using these very few building blocks that are available to them in this environment. So it's a little bit like, you can have the same raw materials, the nails and the wood and, glue or whatnot, but based on your blueprint, which is your DNA genetic code, you can create very different products from that same raw material that you get. So your raw materials in this case would be like your nutrients. Your blueprint is the DNA or the RNA instructions for the organism. And then your products will be whatever organism you're getting at the end of the day. These products are formed with the help of proteins that act as tools for the processes to occur. And these proteins are many times enzymes helping to helping the organisms perform certain reactions that wouldn't have happened without their help. So you can see here again that given one set of instructions, you would need a particular set of tools and you would get a particular product like a doghouse, while the same raw materials using a different genetic blueprint would give you a very different product, even when using the same tools. So in this case, you see a doghouse or a patio table getting formed simply because of the instructions being different. So nutrients and the basic building blocks that we will talk about in the next few lectures are the same for all life, regardless of how complex or simple an organism is. However, what is unique is the blueprint, the DNA, the instructions that are present within that nucleus or within that nucleoid region that tell the cell what it is meant to be and what product it is going to be a part of. And these changes are done with the help of enzymes that help to get all the chemical reactions moving in the cell. So here you can see that all organisms share a common set of molecular features, even when they don't share a common set of physical, outward, macro regions of features. And these common sets of features include the basic needs of the organism at a cellular level in the form of the DNA instructions and the enzymes and the basic subunits of life. They, at the end of the day, will have very ordered structures that will result from the combination of these cells. And they are able to regulate their internal conditions, which is their environment, internal environment, through a process called homeostasis. Similarly, all living things are able to grow and develop. They are able to take in energy and then release it back after using what they need. And they are able to respond to environmental stimuli. So they are able to respond to when they're touched or when they receive heat or light or perceive any other changes in their environment. Most organisms, you will see, will be interacting with their environment, both with the living as well as the non-living things that are present within that ecosystem, within that environment. And finally, organisms are going to be, all living things will be able to reproduce more of themselves and evolve over time through adaptation to environmental stimuli, changes in the environment, changes in the temperature, changes in the humidity, changes in other things in their environment, lack of certain source, so that they can continue to survive within it. So cells are your basic unit of life, whether you are a unicellular or a multicellular organism. And these cells are basically your structural as well as functional unit of life. They will contain all those properties that we just talked about. However, they will have additional properties imparted to them when they come together in this complex organization to create multicellular organisms. So all cells as basic units of life are able to perform all the functions necessary for life, including regulation of their internal environment, taking in and utilizing energy, responding to their internal local environment, immediate environment, maintaining and developing their organization, and being able to reproduce by dividing and forming new cells. So we're going to stop here, and next time we are going to continue our discussion by talking about organization of living things within an ecosystem, and then talking about the scientific method. Hope you enjoyed this. Take care.